start looking at the next chapter, all about the 1960s, or the stormy 60s. And this is an incredibly tumultuous decade, which I'm sure a lot of you already have some knowledge of, some background in. It's a dramatic contrast from the conformity and seeming, kind of almost complacency of the 1950s. If that seemed kind of dull politically, again, the 1960s is a major contrast to that, with both huge advancements in some areas and a lot of important new social programs and those kind of things, but also of massive unrest, both resulting in very positive changes and very forward-thinking changes, and also others that caused people to very much question the United States' power and authority, and also, tragic events, not just violent ones, but other events that, again, really kind of started to shake and rattle the cages a bit about, the Cold War, about the United States' stance on communism, on the integrity of government, all of that. So we will see massive advancements and changes, again, a lot of them for very good reasons, and a lot of very positive changes, like, for example, in the way of civil rights. We will also see the United States get involved in one of the lengthiest and least successful military conflicts ever, with the stalemate in Vietnam. And we will see, people rising up and becoming activists for a number of reasons, and really questioning a lot of social norms and social policies. So it is a vast contrast of the 50s, and the optimism at the beginning of the decade, certainly could not have predicted the unrest and the tension that would be present, certainly by the end of the decade. Now, the title of the section, just so you know what that referred to, titled it Kennedy's Camelot. We're looking at the John F. Kennedy administration today, and we'll look at it a bit more in the next couple of days as well, particularly in regards to civil rights, where we're going to look at civil rights kind of on its own. The Kennedy administration has this grand mystique to it. And Camelot, the reason it's called that, oftentimes, the name really doesn't get attached until after Kennedy's death. Camelot at the time, for one thing, was very popular, was the big smash Broadway musical of the time. But Camelot, which was what? The mystical kingdom of King. Yeah, the mystical kingdom of King Arthur and all that. So it invoked that idea of perfection and utopia and knights in shining armor and all of that. And that was kind of the image of Kennedy that a lot of people wanted to remember, or chose to remember, certainly after his death. So it was, later on, certainly not at the time, but later on that term gets used to describe the Kennedy administration, attempting to portray it, for whatever reason, as this kind of shining moment of beauty and splendor and perfection and all these sorts of things, really, capitalizing on the glamour of Kennedy himself and his family and all of those things. So let's take a look at a little bit about Kennedy and his administration and the first election, and kind of what was changing, or what this election kind of demonstrated was changing in American politics. So the election of 1960 is when Kennedy is going to be elected. So Kennedy is running there as a Democrat. Kennedy had been a congressman, not exactly a star congressman, so he's kind of considered the inexperienced one. He does have less experience than his opponent at the time. But he has all the glamour and all of the image that people just lapped up at this time, and something that a lot of people were just kind of fascinated with. He was youthful at the time. He was the youngest person elected to the presidency. He's in his 40s, but that was pretty young for the president. He has a beautiful and glamorous and fashionable wife, young children. There had not been young children in the White House for decades and decades. He just kind of looks the part. And this was a day and age now in which you kind of needed to look the part, because television, was a part of people's daily lives. That was a specific thing that, you kind of had to market yourself towards. So he doesn't have a ton of experience in the national government. He's got some. I don't want to say that he's completely inexperienced, but he was kind of seen as the fresh-faced new voice. But that fact, some people found that incredibly inspiring. He runs against, in 1960, Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon runs as the Republican. And some of you may recognize that Richard Nixon does eventually go on to be president himself, but his first attempt at the presidency is against John F. Kennedy in 1960. Nixon does have a great deal of experience. Nixon was Eisenhower's vice president, and Nixon had really made a name for himself, particularly in all of that Red Scare stuff we were talking about a couple of weeks ago, the whole House of Un-American Activities, the investigation of government employees and trying to weed out communists and all of that. Nixon had really built himself a reputation of being this anti-communist, not exactly a McCarthy, not a making up stuff and coming up with unsubstantiated allegations, but being tough on communists and leading these investigations and showing a lot of leadership there. But in the end, Kennedy, of course, comes across as very inspiring, elegant, glamorous, like I said, all those things, and, really plays up that whole image that he embodies, a new generation of leaders. He's kind of saying in the campaign, it's time for a new group of leaders to come in. These are the people like Kennedy that were around during the whole World War II era and all of that, but they were not in leadership positions. But it's sort of a passing of the torch from the Eisenhowers and the Trumans and those people to this newer generation of leaders that he hoped to bring America into the next age, into the new age. And again, the television and the image thing really played a big role in this election. In fact, many historians would argue that that's how Kennedy wins. Kennedy does win the election, by the way, obviously, by a very narrow margin, okay? It was not a big landslide victory. You want to think sometimes that it was. It was quite narrow. He does not really have a huge mandate for all the things that he wanted to do. But this is the first time that image really probably played into it more than anything else, or gave Kennedy the edge that he needed in order to win. Because this was the very first time that you had a televised presidential debate. We're going to look at a little clip of it here in just a second. And this, there were multiple ones, but just like now, they debate each other a couple of times. This is the first time that had been on TV. First time people really had a chance outside of occasionally seeing a newsreel when they went to see a movie or something, to see presidential candidates in action, and the way a person looked and the way a person conducted themselves in front of the camera made a huge difference in this case, okay? So we're going to look at this clip in just a second, not the whole clip, but just a few minutes. And you'll see that Kennedy, he just looks comfortable in front of the camera. And he's handsome, and he, just seems to look right into the camera. He doesn't look nervous. He seems very confident, all of that. We're not going to hear, in this clip, we're not going to hear too much of Richard Nixon talking. But when it shows him, you'll see he looks real uncomfortable. He looks nervous, and he just does not come across as looking, the cool customer that Kennedy does. So we're just going to watch a few minutes of this, like I said, and I hope we can hear it. I know sometimes the sound on these is not great, but we can at least see if we can't hear. Okay, so we're just going to watch a few minutes.
Secondly, I think the question is, what are the programs that we advocate? What is the party record that we lead? I come out of the Democratic Party, which in this century has produced Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman, and which supported and sustained these programs which I've discussed tonight. Mr. Nixon comes out of the Republican Party. He was nominated by it. And it is a fact that through most of these last 25 years, the Republican leadership has opposed federal aid for education, medical care for the aged, development of the Tennessee Valley, development of our natural resources. I think Mr. Nixon is an effective leader of his party. I hope he would grant me the same. The question before us is, which point of view and which party do we want to lead the United States? Mr. Nixon, would you like to comment on that statement? I have no comment. The next question to Vice President Nixon.
Can you imagine a political candidate today saying, I have no comment? No, not exactly. Did you notice how Nixon just looked a little jumpy? I don't know if you can see it really well, but he's sweating. And that was a big problem for him, was he would sweat profusely in the cameras and the lights, and it just made him look bad. He didn't want, I think, at least I heard, I'm not sure if this is true, but that Kennedy allowed them to put, a little powder makeup on him, and Nixon wouldn't have any of that, the stuff that keeps you from looking like that on camera. But again, what's interesting is a lot of folks at the time listened. Some people didn't have television, and they listened to it on the radio, and they surveyed people, and overwhelmingly people that listened to the debate thought that Nixon did a lot better. Some of them actually thought that he technically, you don't really have like a score, but would have argued that Nixon won the debate, that he made more sense. And if you watch the whole thing, he does make a lot of sense when he talks, and he sounds reasonable. And people listening to it thought that Kennedy wasn't all that good, and his responses were real wooden. They sounded super rehearsed. He says and a whole lot. You kind of heard him do that a little bit. But the people that watched it overwhelmingly thought that Kennedy was better. So again, image and the way a person looked and how they appeared on camera, that really, the fact that television really changes politics. It really changes the way that people campaign, the way that they appeal to certain voters. So the New Frontier becomes this sort of, it's both a slogan sort of for the Kennedy campaign, that's sort of the idea that he's campaigning on, and then it also, that same name gets sort of attached to Kennedy's domestic programs, to Kennedy's domestic agenda. So kind of like how the New Deal gets attached to Roosevelt's, ideas, the New Frontier sort of gets attached to Kennedy's, although his domestic program is nothing as expansive or wide-reaching or specific as something like the New Deal was. So the New Frontier does refer to some of these programs, but again, it also is just the concept of new opportunities, new leadership. It's Kennedy saying, I'm part of this new crop of leaders, and it's time to, move on from that World War II kind of generation and trying to inspire, younger people, to get them to be inspired to run for office, to be in government, to volunteer, to do something for that country, something for your country. Some of you know of Kennedy's famous inaugural address, the whole ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country, trying to encourage young people and inspire them to get involved in some kind of a way. But the New Frontier does also, like I said, the name gets attached to his specific agenda, his specific things he wanted to get done, which he's far less successful with than we might want. So some of the things included in the New Frontier, some of the goals that Kennedy had, one was space travel and to make advancements in the space race. We know that Sputnik had been launched just a few years before this. That was 57, I think. And remember, that made Americans fear that they were falling behind, that the Soviets were getting ahead of us, and we're supposed to be the technologically advanced ones. And so Kennedy kind of makes it part of his goal to make sure the United States caught up, and that the United States would be the first to get people into space and to even go to the moon, hopefully by the end of the 1960s. So he makes that a priority. And therefore, we see the creation of NASA. We talked about NASA before, but didn't mention it specifically. Of course, NASA, the government organization, government corporation, to research and develop that space travel. And there's massive funding going into that for throughout the 1960s. And it is in regard to the space race and in regard to space exploration and all that technology. Of all the domestic goals of Kennedy, although he won't live to see, the realization of them, that is the one that certainly gets the most attention and it has the most success. We're not going to talk so much about the history of the space program, but y'all know that, within a few years, the United States is launching manned rockets, and eventually that culminates, of course, in the Apollo missions and the first lunar landing in July of 1969. Now, obviously, that is way past Kennedy's administration. As Kennedy dies in 63, but it is the culmination, certainly, of what was, one of his goals, and what seemed like an impossible goal. In 1960, when he says we're going to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade, that seemed impossible. In 10 years, could we actually develop the technology and the ability to do that? And they made it work just in time with July 69. Landing the first man on the moon. So of Kennedy's New Frontier kind of ideas, it's in regards to the space race and the space program where I think you could argue there is the most success. Other parts of the New Frontier included some economic reforms that Kennedy wanted that are far less successful and also not as exciting or, dare I say, as sexy as space travel. Anyway, he wanted to cut taxes and tackle inequality and, all kind of just real general kind of things, it sounds. And it is with the tax cuts and the trying to improve inequality and poverty and some of those things, Health care, minimum wage. Those are some things where Kennedy is not able to accomplish a whole lot. Kennedy's not incredibly successful with Congress. Congress balks at most of that stuff, and it kind of stalls out. So again, the image of Kennedy is sometimes that, super popular, and he is after his death for sure. But during that administration, he faced the same kind of challenges that any president might face. And it is with those economic improvements where there's not a whole lot done. A lot of it stalls out and fizzles out in Congress. So there's not really any specific acts or laws or things like that to talk about with that. So the New Frontier, referring to those things, but also referring to this ideal, this concept of moving into the future and moving into a new age and all of those things that would come along with it. Now, the big things when it comes to Kennedy and domestic policy and Kennedy's actions regarding domestic issues that actually have a major impact other than the space exploration stuff is mostly in regards to civil rights, which Kennedy is kind of ideally supportive of, but does not think that federal intervention is the best way to go about it. However, Kennedy, a lot like Eisenhower before him, will get kind of forced into that, sort of dragged into it, kicking and screaming, and will end up taking significant action regarding civil rights. We're going to look at all that part of it a little bit later. I'd rather look at civil rights on its own. So we'll come back and see Kennedy a little bit later, but certainly, he's not the reason why civil rights movement happened. So he's just sort of, implementing certain decisions at the federal level. But the big things when we think about Kennedy's administration, where he does have direct impact in one way or another, good and bad, is in regard to foreign policy. There are some major foreign policy crises that happen under the Kennedy administration, where we will see Kennedy handle things in ways sometimes which he is praised for, and others which he may not be. And we see extremely tense situations. Kennedy happens to come into office at one of the very heightened periods in the Cold War. And Kennedy wants to be bold, he wants to be confrontational, but we also will see, the realization will come, as we'll see in a moment, as bold, if you get really bold and really confrontational, ultimately, that can spell destruction for both sides. So we're going to see some of that here in just a second. Now, Kennedy, his overall approach to the Cold War becomes called flexible response. So this is his sort of take on how we want to approach Cold War policy and the line that we're going to take towards the Soviet Union. It's kind of like, Eisenhower had the whole massive retaliation, brinksmanship, all of that. Kennedy's version of it is flexible response. So he wants to do it a little bit differently than the massive retaliation stuff. It includes, the threat of nuclear weapons. But the flexible response means we'll use multiple tools. It won't just be about nuclear weapons. So we want to be flexible and not just rely on nuclear weapons and not just use the threat of nuclear war. That will be one thing. So he does keep that on the table. He's not saying, let's get rid of all the nuclear weapons. But he's saying that's going to be one of the ways that we might approach the Soviet Union, or one of the ways that we might deal with some of these conflicts. So it does include the threat of nuclear weapons, but also more conventional weapons. More conventional weapons and better conventional weapons. What are conventional weapons? Yeah, stuff that's not nuclear weapons. So better airplanes, better bombs, and other kind of things that are going to be, and this is, where we start to get what later leads to the more technologically advanced weapons of today, like with the missile guidance systems and, bombs that are far more accurate. They can hit really direct targets, down to a, just a little pinpoint kind of a thing. So more conventional weapons needed to be developed and more research in those kinds of weapons as opposed to just focusing on nuclear capability. And a third component would be diplomacy. So we continue to use diplomacy. We do not abandon diplomacy, discussing and engaging with other countries, engaging with the Soviet Union and trying to work things out with agreement and, with cooperation. So we're going to employ all of that. We want to cooperate. We want to, work with everybody, but we also are going to, be ready to defend ourselves and use that threat of nuclear war if necessary. And part of the diplomacy wasn't just about ambassadors and NATO and that kind of thing, Some of this was about, there was this concept come up with that Kennedy believed in and other leaders, that we have to kind of convince other people around the world, particularly people in the third world, underdeveloped places, that communism is not good, that communism is not a good idea, that there's a better way. And one of the ways that we can do that is help people in the third world, in underdeveloped parts of the world, in poverty-stricken parts of the world, where maybe they don't have electricity, or maybe they don't have good roads, and maybe they don't have education, to help people there so that they will not see communism as attractive. The belief being that people that were in poverty, people that lived in chaos, that they would be kind of seduced by the promises of communism, and that was how communism was spreading. So the idea was, if we convince people that democracy is the way, if we can get them on our side, convince them that we're the good guys and that democracy is great, that it's not in their best interest to be communist, then we will be successful. And that's what programs like the Peace Corps were designed to do. Peace Corps is still around. It's a government program, but it's a volunteer program. So it's a government program that recruits volunteers to serve and to help improve people's lives in other parts of the world, particularly in the third world, places that are rather underdeveloped and where there's a lot of poverty, where people may not have good access to health care, where people may not have schools, all those kind of things. Peace Corps volunteers will be deployed and are deployed and all over the world, maybe to work in a hospital somewhere, or maybe to help distribute food to people that need food, or medical supplies, or maybe they're going to help build roads or something along those lines. It's volunteer work, and people trying to help improve the standard of living for others, so forth and so on. You can see that's real consistent with Kennedy's kind of goal and theme of encouraging people to volunteer and to into service and those kind of things. But this was also seen by Kennedy and others as a means, in a way, of not just improving the world, but maybe also fighting communism, to help people not be as susceptible to that, and to see the United States as a helpful partner, and not, the enemy that the Soviet Union might portray them to be. Now, again, there are some major crises that Kennedy presides over, some of which are handled. The assessment of Kennedy's handling of these events varies. The first one we want to look at was happening in Berlin, which, remember, Berlin is where? In Germany, right? And remember where we left this, what had happened to Berlin? It's divided, right? Okay, we have East Berlin, West Berlin, just like there's East Germany and West Germany. Well, the Soviet Union in 1961 closes the border between East Berlin and West Berlin, shuts it down so that people won't be able to go from one to the other. It's very similar to what had happened back in the 40s that resulted in the Berlin airlift. But the Soviet Union is irritated. Oh, irritated, not strong enough of a word. But they're very angry that a lot of people keep escaping to West Berlin. Thousands of people all the time escaping to West Berlin and crossing over into West Berlin, the Democratic side. And not just people from Berlin doing that, but people from that whole communist bloc. It wasn't just Berliners, but people from the whole Eastern Europe communist bloc getting to Berlin and then getting into West Berlin and then getting an airplane out or something like that, using that as kind of an escape and all that. So they cut off the access, cut off the roads and everything, and shut it all down, trying to prevent that. Because as you can imagine, that completely undermines the Soviet argument that communism was better and that people were happy under communism when you've got thousands of people fleeing it all of the time, not just in Berlin, but all over that communist bloc. So they cut it off, and Kennedy is outraged by it and wants to show support for Berliners. He actually went to Berlin himself, where he kind of gave a famous speech where he said to Berliners, people in West Berlin, we're on your side, we're standing with you. But otherwise doesn't take any direct action to try to stop the Soviet Union from cutting off that access. And this is the point where, in order to permanently cut off that access and try to stop the defection, stop the people trying to escape to West Berlin and to escape the communist bloc, this is when the Soviet Union will start building the infamous Berlin Wall. So an actual physical wall, brick by brick, separating East Berlin and West Berlin. And so this became a major symbol of the Cold War itself, and remain, even though the Berlin Wall was torn down in '89, that becomes until then a major symbol of the Berlin Wall. You know, we talked a couple weeks ago about the whole concept of the Iron Curtain and the Iron Curtain falling over Europe. You know, that was a metaphor, but the Berlin Wall becomes this physical representation of that division and that physical, division between communism of the East and democracy of the West. So it furthers those tensions and becomes that physical symbol, an actual physical Iron Curtain. Sometimes people even mistakenly believe that the Berlin Wall is the Iron Curtain, but again, the Iron Curtain was a figurative kind of thing and referring to the much larger separation. So the Berlin crisis, Kennedy, tries to show support, but there's no other general action taken other than, saying, shame on you, we don't like that. But the Berlin Wall is nevertheless built, and that makes defections and all those things much more difficult, because the wall would be not only tall and difficult to get over, but surrounded by barbed wire. Usually we think about cities and countries and empires building walls to keep people out, but the Berlin Wall was built to keep people in and keep people from escaping. Now, the Berlin crisis was something that occupied Kennedy's mind a great deal, and perhaps one of the reasons why he makes certain decisions that he does in regard to Latin America. Probably some of the most memorable things that occur under the Kennedy administration regarding the Cold War happen much, much, much closer to home than Berlin. Two major events that occurred in Cuba. Let's remind ourselves, Cuba, last place we left this, Cuba had recently been, there had been a revolution, a civil war in Cuba, and who had emerged as the leader of Cuba? Fidel Castro. And then after he takes over, then starts growing increasingly communist and just anti-American overall, citing this, what was truly a long period of American interference and American meddling and not letting Cuba have true independence and all of those things. Now, the United States was not very thrilled with that, didn't like Castro even before he really became super communist. And so there were already, even before Kennedy comes into office, there was already talk and already, pressure to do something about Castro, to try to dislodge him from power. And certainly once Cuba becomes communist and Castro starts warming up more and more to the Soviet Union, as opposed to the United States, those calls for some kind of action become a bit more serious. When Kennedy comes into office, he learns that under the Eisenhower administration, they were already kind of laying plans, or at least, hypothetically thinking about a CIA operation to overthrow Castro. And Kennedy decides to go with it, even though it was rather sketchy and a lot of people advised against it. Kennedy decides to go with it, and that's going to result in what's called the Bay of Pigs invasion. This was an operation designed to, what they did, or the CIA did, which, by the way, that's the Central Intelligence Agency. If you don't know, that's basically the spies. And they were involved in the overthrow in Iran and all those kind of things. So covert operations like this have been done before, and some of them have been relatively successful. But the idea was the CIA would train Cuban refugees, because a lot of Cubans had fled, right? A lot of Cubans had fled to the United States when Castro took over. So the idea was to recruit some of those, a couple hundred thousands of those Cuban refugees and train them to fight, train them in guerrilla warfare and all those things, and then land them in the Bay of Pigs, which you see on the map there, in Cuba, and that they would lead a revolution against Castro. So we're going to train these Cuban refugees, send them back to Cuba, and then they will lead this revolution and overthrow Castro, and all of America's problems will be solved. The idea also, or the assumption was, that when these trained fighters arrived and the rebellion started, that Cubans would rise up in rebellion with them. So it very much depends on the idea, the gamble, that Cubans don't like Castro either. They just haven't been able to get rid of him, and so there'll be this mass uprising when these forces arrive. Well, as you can imagine, that's not at all what happens. It's a complete disaster. These recruits, these refugees land in the Bay of Pigs, and they never really get anywhere. They barely even get out of the Bay of Pigs itself before they are overwhelmed by Cuban forces. Castro already knew that this was about to happen. They were overwhelmed by some of his own men. They were captured. And the whole mass uprising that was supposed to happen, all the other Cubans, when the citizens would rise up against Castro and join them, that doesn't happen at all. So they end up trapped, they end up surrounded, they end up captured. So Kennedy, he could have, he has a choice here. He could send in more support. He could send in airstrikes or, try to evacuate those forces before that could happen. But he knew that if he did that, that would just escalate the thing even further, and that might get the Soviet Union involved, and then we got a really big mess on our hands. So he has no choice but to just let that happen. And so the whole thing fails. Cuba, of course, remains firmly in the hands of Castro. And how does this make the United States, or how does it make Kennedy look?
Pretty bad.
Pretty bad. Looks kind of ill-conceived, and it makes Kennedy look weak when he specifically would not send in air support, would not send in additional assistance to those fighters. It makes him look weak. It makes it look like it was all kind of a big bluff, and when it came down to it, that the United States would not follow through and would not, follow through with its convictions, didn't have the courage to actually do that. And that is partially what leads to, or one of the things that influences the next big showdown in Cuba, because it did make Kennedy look quite weak. And Khrushchev, remember Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union at this point, now sees Kennedy as kind of weak and thinks that if the Soviet Union does take some kind of action in Cuba, that the United States will not fight back and the United States won't do anything about it. So that leads to certainly the most tense days in the Kennedy administration for sure, and perhaps some of the most intense, certainly one of the scariest incidents of probably the entire Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962. So, still kind of licking the wounds from the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, in October of 1962, American spy planes discover that there are missile sites being built in Cuba by the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is building, they haven't put the missiles there yet, but they are building the structure, the facilities, to put nuclear missiles in Cuba that could then be pointed right at the United States. And once again, what is true of the proximity of Cuba to the United States, which is 90 miles south of Florida. So this would allow, if it's done, that would allow the Soviet Union to launch a direct attack within minutes that would take out, estimates show, pretty much half or more of the United States are going to have at least an effect on that much. So let me show you. I'll come back to all this in a second. So this is one of the pictures that these, those U-2 spy planes, the reconnaissance planes flying over, found. So there's these missile sites, some of the pictures, and there's some of the different says probable guidance missiles, things like that, transporters that they reported back. Okay, so very tense situation, and this whole thing lasts nearly 2 weeks as we're going back and forth, and this intense standoff as Kennedy insists we can't allow that to happen. Even though the Soviet Union has not broken any laws, they've not broken any treaties, there's no rule anywhere saying they can't put missiles in Cuba. But Kennedy, of course, is going to take the stance that cannot be allowed, that we cannot allow the Soviet Union to put missiles in Cuba. But he's got a very difficult decision to make about what do you do about it? Do we launch airstrikes on Cuba? Do we invade Cuba? What do we do about this? It's not going to provoke a nuclear war. It's not going to provoke a third world war. So Kennedy decides, and it's, again, a very, very delicate, very tense situation. Certainly the closest the United States ever gets to nuclear war is right here. If you talk to, maybe not your parents are probably a little too young, but certainly grandparents probably remember this. They'll tell you, what it was like in these couple of days. Everybody glued to the TV, see what's going to happen next. Kennedy announces a naval quarantine. That's a fun word, isn't it? You know what that means. Something different now, I guess. Naval quarantine of Cuba. Basically a blockade. It's another word, and he's going to decide to call that for a blockade of Cuba. In other words, American ships, American naval vessels, are going to surround or be around the waters around Cuba to prevent the Soviet Union from bringing in any weapons, to prevent them from bringing in those missiles and prevent them from working on those sites anymore. Now, he doesn't call it a blockade. He uses the word naval quarantine, because a blockade is technically an act of war, or it could be considered an act of war. So he's careful with the language to say it is a naval blockade. So American ships, American submarines are going to be there to prevent the Soviet Union from showing up with any missiles. And there are back and forth telegrams and letters and so forth. You're going to look at one of them in a little bit, between Kennedy and Khrushchev, trying to work out some kind of agreement. Because while they both want to dig their heels in and stand firm, and they both have some things that are kind of non-negotiable here, they also both kind of realize the consequence if it does come to blows. And again, it's very tense time. Everybody watching things on TV. Kennedy goes on television, addresses the country. I'm going to show you this little clip right here. Here's Kennedy on television addressing the country. So imagine, you're in your living room listening to the president talk about this scary situation.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. Only last Thursday, as evidence of this rapid offensive buildup was already in my hand, Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko told me in my office that he was instructed to make it clear once again, as he said his government had already done, that Soviet assistance to Cuba, and I quote, pursued solely the purpose of contributing to the defense capabilities of Cuba, unquote. That, and I quote him, training by Soviet specialists of Cuban nationals in handling defensive armaments was by no means offensive. And if it were otherwise, Mr. Gromyko went on, the Soviet government would never become involved in rendering such assistance, unquote. That statement also was false. Acting therefore in defense of our own security and of the entire Western Hemisphere, and under the authority entrusted to me by the Constitution, as endorsed by the resolution of the Congress, I have directed that the following initial steps be taken immediately. To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound to Cuba, from whatever nation or port, will, if found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. I call upon Chairman Khrushchev to halt and eliminate this clandestine, reckless, and provocative threat to world peace and the stable relations between our two nations. I call upon him further to abandon this course of world domination and to join in an historic effort to end the perilous arms race and to transform the history of man. Our goal is not the victory of might, but the vindication of right. Not peace at the expense of freedom, but both peace and freedom here in this hemisphere. And we hope around the world, God willing, that goal will be achieved.
All right. So what did Kennedy say if there's any kind of an attack by the Soviet Union? He's launching a nuclear missile. What's the United States going to do? Retaliate. So again, people are just scared to death. People are rushing to gather supplies. A lot of people have bomb shelters, in these days. They even ordered the cabinet, all their wives, which all the cabinet was men at this time, of course. All their wives were ordered to leave Washington, D.C., and people were really prepared for the worst. In the end, through multiple telegrams, letters, phone calls, frantic wheeling and dealing, they work out an agreement. And the United States, or the Soviets, agree to remove or to stop building those missile sites, not to put any missiles in Cuba. The United States agrees to remove some missiles from Turkey. There were missiles in the United States. The United States claimed they were outdated and going to be removed anyway. But there were some missile sites in Turkey that the United States agrees to dismantle, while the Soviet Union agrees to dismantle the missile sites in Cuba. So the Soviets eventually backed down with some concessions from the United States as well. The United States also agrees not to invade Cuba because there was talk of an invasion of Cuba to try to dislodge Castro and all that business, and that was something that the Soviets kind of thought was imminent, and one of the reasons maybe why they started building those missile sites there in the first place. So the Soviets do back down. The tension is relieved, at least for a bit, and really quite significantly for some time. Because, like I said, this was certainly the scariest and arguably the closest the United States ever got to a full-scale nuclear war. And both sides, both the United States and the Soviet Union, kind of realized after this, not to say they didn't know it before, but it's one of those things where it just makes it far more real. Once all this is over, kind of realize that they need to, find other options, that they need to try to de-escalate these tensions. Because something like this, this is just going to be not good for anybody, and that nobody will win. In the end, if we can't back off a little bit, and if we can't de-escalate this a little bit, nobody is going to win. They come to realize what eventually becomes called the principle of MAD, that's M-A-D, which stands for mutually assured destruction. Mutually assured destruction. What do you think that means, mutually assured destruction?
Nuclear war retaliation on multiple powers dead.
Yeah. So if they fire nukes on us or they fire nukes on them, either way, it doesn't matter who shoots first. Somebody's going to shoot second. And if we do that, then nobody survives. That we both have the capability basically to blow each other off the face of the earth, and nobody's going to win in that situation. So we don't want to get to this point again. We don't want to get to the point where we're threatening nuclear war, that we've got to do something to try to back off and back down. So the Cuban Missile Crisis actually leads, certainly not to an end of the Cold War by any means, but it does lead to some easing of tensions and some attempts on both sides to try to ease that a little bit more, realizing that nuclear war is going to be devastating for both. So it does lead to some instances and some attempts to try to de-escalate, keep using that word, try to ease those tensions a little bit, including for the first time a treaty regarding nuclear weapons. There'll be multiple ones of these, of course, over the years. The very first one is called the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. It banned the testing of new nuclear weapons in the atmosphere. So you couldn't detonate or test any kind of nuclear weapons in the air, either up in the upper atmosphere or in space. So it doesn't mean you can't develop nuclear weapons, and it certainly doesn't put any limitations on how many you can have and some of the things that may come later. So it's not going to reduce the armaments themselves, and it doesn't mean you can't test them. It's just going to force both the United States and Soviet Union and whoever else to test them underground. But it is a step, though, towards some kind of control over nuclear weapons, a step towards some kind of de-escalation, a step towards some kind of cooperation and, insistence that they had to put a limit on it somewhere. So even though it's not like everybody does away with their nuclear weapons because of this, and it certainly doesn't mean they go anywhere, it's a step in that direction. This is also the point where you may have seen, like in movies and stuff, like the red phone in the White House that goes directly to the Soviet Union. That was a real thing. And they installed that after the Cuban Missile Crisis. There's a red phone that went directly to the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union had one that went directly to the United States, so they could communicate directly to each other in such an event, and not have to go back and forth with telegrams and letters and phone calls and things like that. So makes it sound a little bit scarier, but it actually kind of made things perhaps a little bit easier because they could communicate more directly and maybe communicate a little bit better. Okay, and lastly for Kennedy and foreign policy, we're just going to talk about Kennedy's actions and Kennedy's response to Vietnam. This is, again, a growing thing. This is not sudden. We know that the United States, or the backstory we already have, is that the United States has been involved in the Vietnam situation for a long time now, first by supporting the French, and then once the French pulled out of Vietnam, trying to support Diem, remember the Democratic leader of South Vietnam. But by the time Kennedy takes office, that is getting harder and harder to do. Diem, the leader of the Democratic, or pro-American anyway, South Vietnamese government was not democratic at all. I mentioned that before, that his control was getting very, very shaky in South Vietnam because he was growing more and more autocratic, more and more unreasonable. He was not allowing the kind of democratic reforms and freedoms and rights and elections and all of those things that he had promised. And he was incredibly repressive. He's basically become a dictator. He's become the very kind of leader the United States has typically stood against, but because he's in favor of the United States and claims to be anti-communist, the United States finds themselves in this weird position of having to support him. But there's more and more uprising taking place in South Vietnam, and we talked about the Viet Cong last time. They're starting to form, guerrilla movement against Diem's government. So it's getting harder and harder for the United States to quell that whole situation. So you've got turmoil in South Vietnam itself, and this doesn't even involve North Vietnam and the threat of the communists in North Vietnam. So all of that is leading to a very shaky situation. And so Kennedy starts to increase the American military presence in Vietnam, starts to send over more troops, more support to Vietnam. At this point, they would say it was not to fight a war, not to help anybody fight. It's about providing stability. Advisors, they would have been called in this situation. It's troops to help the South Vietnamese to, kind of prop up Diem's government to create stability and prevent this whole thing from collapsing. And there were a couple of thousand troops already in Vietnam when Kennedy took office. It is probably about 16,000 by the time Kennedy leaves office. So the number of American forces there has increased to try to stop all this turmoil. And this is a very famous photo, as you can't, the crackdown in South Vietnam by Diem was a lot against Buddhist monks. And so a lot of these Buddhist monks in protest were like this man here, a very famous photo, just setting themselves on fire and killing themselves in protest. And that was making it very, very difficult for the United States to continue to support Diem, which eventually they didn't. So there was also a coup that the United States, which is like an overthrow, that the United States didn't orchestrate, but encouraged to overthrow Diem. And so that just leads to even more instability. So even with Diem out of the way, when the United States decided he's got to go, it still did not solve that situation. So there's still a great deal of instability and turmoil in South Vietnam, and the American troop presence has been escalated even further, and then we'll see it escalate even more under Johnson. Okay, so we're going to stop there with that today. Tomorrow we'll finish up that section before looking at Johnson with the end of the Kennedy administration, which of course ends very tragically, contributing to that overall image of Camelot and all of those things. Okay, so two things.